All right, this is the Kyosho RB Type-R. This was released, I think, around 1998 or 1997. So although it doesn't necessarily classify as, well, it wouldn't fit into the vintage two-wheel drive buggy class at the Vintage Off-Road Nationals. That's 1995 or earlier. It's still a vintage buggy by, let's say, today's standards, because it's almost 20, more than 20 years old. Now, the reason why I'm making a video on this is because I am getting this ready for another vintage race. RC10 Talk is going to have a race at Insanity RC in New Jersey, and that's a bit more of a, let's say, a conventional dirt track. And they're going to add a class called Y2K Buggy, and that's all two-wheel drive buggies produced after the year 2000. I would think that this would still fall into that classification as a late 90s buggy, because the RB Type-R Evolution was released sometime in the early 2000s. It's basically the Type-R with a few changes. I think it comes with blue aluminum parts, and it uses CVAs instead of universals in the back. See, these have universals here. It also came with M3 threaded screws. These came with self-tapping screws. So last night I just went through this and replaced almost all of the screws with M3 screws. But otherwise it's like the same exact buggy. And this is basically a Kyosho copy of the RC10B3. It's not an exact copy. Geometrically it's very similar, but because it's a Kyosho, it has higher quality parts, and in some ways it's actually a little bit more tunable. So I'd like to go over just a few little details about this that make it interesting to me. Number one, this is essentially the precursor to the RB5 buggy, so there are going to be a lot of things that look kind of similar between this and an RB5. But there are some differences. For example, let's just start at the front here. The front arms, although they look kind of similar to RB5 arms, one key thing here is there's only one mounting hole for the bottom of the shock on the front arm. You got two mounting holes on the tower, so front shock angle tunability isn't quite there, but you do get three holes here on the tower, okay? And the caster block setup and spindle carrier setup is quite interesting. The ball stud here that you mount the outer camber link, or the, let's say the front camber link outer ball cup to, this actually runs all the way through this assembly. So this ball stud is basically connected to a shaft that runs through the caster block, through a hole in the spindle carrier, and all the way down, and you close it off with an E-clip at the bottom. So there's spacers here, 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 and here. The idea here is that you can use the spacers on the inside to adjust the spindle carrier position, the height, and you can use these spacers to basically move this ball stud up or down to adjust the front roll center. So roll center is done here, and then camber gain is done here. That's kind of neat. Now, in terms of the spindle carrier itself, it looks a bit similar in size and shape to the Kyosho RB5 setup, so you may be able to swap an RB5 steering assembly into this. I haven't tried it personally, but it looks like it might fit. But okay, if you want to run, for example, hex front wheels. Getting to the wheels, by the way, these are actually RC10 B2/B3 wheels, and they're an exact fit. In fact, in the Kyosho manual, even though you use metric bearings in the gearbox, you use standard bearings on the front wheels. The wheel axles, these Kyosho wheel axles, are actually meant to fit wheels with standard bearings on them. So if you have a B2 or a B3, or even like an old World's car with those dish rims, like with the offset, those are an exact fit. So the modern, like the J Concepts B2 reproduced wheels, those will fit on this car exactly with no modification. Okay, so that's really convenient. And that's okay. So that's more or less the front, and in the rear we have, let's say, a vintage-like arrangement for the rear inner ball stud, where it mounts against the bulkhead from the back. The RB5, that ball stud would mount down like this which would make it easier to adjust. Here it's a bit more of a pain. So I'd say that's more vintage style, as it were. And you can see, okay, here's the universal joint, the rear hub carrier. This looks like it's the same part that you would use in the ZXS Evolution or the TF4, the Spider TF4 on-road car. It has 3 mounting holes on the bottom here to the for this hinge pin. But you can just tell by the shape of the top here that it looks like this is being the same generation as the TF4 and the ZXS Evo, all of which, by the way, were produced in the late 90s. So it makes sense. There is a spacer, I think, in the back here. You can move this back or forward to move the hub carrier around for wheelbase and weight distribution. The differential is, let's say, older style in that on the more modern Kyosho cars with the ball diff, some of them had like a clip around the diff outdrive, and you could like take that clip off and you put like you know, something in there, and you can actually adjust the ball diff from the outside without having to like pop off a ball cup and tighten the thrust bearing, the thrust bolt. This one's more conventional. You have to adjust the thrust bolt from the outside by, you know, popping off a ball cup. The shocks are incredibly smooth, and what I noticed maybe why they're smooth is because the shock shaft themselves are relatively short compared to the size of the shock body. These do appear to be the stock parts, so just the way the car was set up, if you know, when you put oil in the shock body, both front and rear, by the way, if you bleed the shock, that shock shaft's not going all the way up to the top. So generally when that happens, you're not going to push a whole lot of oil out of the shock body when you're bleeding the shock, which means you get fewer air bubbles. And they're very, very smooth. And these are really nice and plush. So I think this will be a whole lot of fun to drive on a nice dirt off-road track. So what else kind of stands out? This piece here is kind of interesting. This may look similar in shape to those of you familiar with the older Kyosho Ultimas from the late 80s. It kind of had this sort of rear brace extending around from the top of the gearbox to the bottom of the chassis, but those are made of aluminum. This one's plastic, so it's lighter weight. Okay, yeah, and then you have your usual, like, if we flip it over, you got your T-plate on the back, so it still uses that. You have the chassis itself ends here, and then you have a kick-up plate, or not even really a kick-up plate, just a front plate to the front. I think the RB5 works in the same way. And then you have these inner hinge pin mounts here. What I did while I was sort of getting this car ready was to put a 1mm spacer under the rear inner hinge pin mount there to reduce the anti-squat to what looks like to be 0 or near 0. If you don't do that, you get quite a bit of anti-squat, which if you're on a high grip track is useful, but if you're racing on low grip or dirt or like a bumpy surface, you tend to want lower anti-squat to help settle down the rear. And that's basically it. Looks like a cool car. I'm excited to be able to finally have a class that I can run this in. Otherwise, I was thinking of running it in the silver can class at RCHR, but I already have my Kyosho RB5 for that, so I don't really need this for the silver can class. So hopefully at about a month's time, maybe a little bit more than a month's time, when I go to this race, I'll be able to get some video footage of this running. So yeah, that's it for now. Thanks for watching.